Nothing excites me. I'm 55 years old. I've been doing this every day for 30 plus years. Nothing excites me. It's all work, right? It's a very satisfying job. I love my job, and I get to work with the most interesting people on earth. And I get to allow people to fulfill their creative ambitions, which is extremely rewarding. But there's no ecstasy in my execution of my job. It's a job. Hi, my name is Steve Albini, and we are in the center field room of Electrical Audio in Chicago. I have 3 Pachinko machines. They are all broken. At one point, I bought a bunch of Pachinko balls off of eBay, and the Diamond Dave Duvall, who was the resident mechanical wizard at the studio, he's the guy that built all the furniture you see. He got one of them sort of working for a while, and that was the end of it. So I have 3 broken Pachinko machines, although I'm crossing my fingers that later today I'm only going to have 2.
I'll take that Pachinko machine.
I started playing in bands as a teenager in the late 70s in my hometown of Missoula, Montana. And then I moved to Chicago in 1980, got involved in the music scene here in the punk rock music scene. So I developed minimal set of skills doing band recording in a kind of an informal fashion, and eventually built a studio in the basement of a house that I bought.
We are going to be given a tour by Mr. Steve Albini. This is his basement studio.
All the air spaces on the interior wall were caulked up and sealed with furring strips and felt. The natural progression of that was to build a more professional space, and so we bought this building in December of 1995. This is the control room of Studio A. These are the stereo mixdown machines. These are Ampex ATR 102s. They've all been reconditioned either by Mike Spitz or his successors at the ATR Services Company in Pennsylvania, or by Greg Norman, our house technical engineer. Equipment racks. This is our custom Neotech Elite console, designed by Craig Connolly. He was the founder and designer at Neotech. And I think this was the last console that he worked on personally. It's a 48 input frame, meaning that there are 24 mono channels here, 24 mono channels here. The original concept there being that in the analog era, there were some productions that were 48 track analog where you'd have 2 multi-track machines slaved together. I've essentially never done that myself, but that wasn't uncommon for bigger productions in the analog era. And then at the dawn of the digital era, it wasn't uncommon for there to be an analog multi-track and a Pro Tools rig running simultaneously on the same session. My personal aesthetic as a recording engineer is that my principal job is to record the sound of the band and not to try to create a sound and apply it to the band. That has implicit in it some character, right? When you see a band perform, typically they're performing in an acoustic space. So there is an acoustic interaction of the instruments with the environment they're in. To me, it sounds more naturalistic to have that acoustic ambience represented in the recording. So if the guitars are really loud and you hear no reverberant effect of the room from a really loud sound, that sounds slightly alien to me. Or if the drums are really energetic and there's a lot of space around the drums and you don't hear the interaction of the drums with the acoustic environment, you don't hear any ambient sound of the drums, it sounds slightly artificial, sounds slightly stylized to me. So my default is always to try to record the sound of the room that the band is playing in addition to the direct sound of the instruments. I have always favored that as a default. Like, if you can start from the natural presentation, it's easy, and sometimes happens accidentally, that you stylize it from there, that it gets slightly, that it gets made more eccentric, from there. But if you start from a position of artificiality, if you start with everything alien and everything different from the way it normally is, then it's very difficult to get to a naturalistic presentation from there. This is a really nice compressor. The really nice compressor is kind of shocking in that it's the only thing I can think of that is pretty good for $200. And if you need something that's significantly better, you have to spend 10 times as much, Yeah. Yeah, it's a very useful, very easy to work with stereo compressor. And the same guy, FMR Audio, he makes a mic preamp called the Really Nice Preamp. And that mic preamp is also pretty good. I mean, it doesn't have to be, considering how cheap it is. It's primarily being sold through guitar shops and stuff. But it holds its, the preamp and the Really Nice compressor will both hold their own with any of the other stuff that we have. Like this GML dynamic range controller right here. This is super sophisticated parametric stereo limiter compressor. Extremely flexible controls, very, very fine-grained. You can, really fine-tune the behavior of the channels and the stereo interaction between the channels, but that's like a $5,000 thing, right? This thing is super fast and easy to use, and it sounds almost as good, and it solves almost as many problems. So I personally like having stuff that I know I will never have to make excuses for, It's not like, this is pretty good as long as it stays in its lane, it's okay for metal. I wouldn't use it on an acoustic guitar, but, I like to have all of our equipment. I like to be like stuff that I would not be afraid to use in any circumstance. This Josephson microphone has proven very popular with rap vocalists and other people where the voice is like the principal sound on the record that you're paying attention to. I mean, it's a principal sound on a lot of records, but particularly in rap, like the character of the voice is like the most important thing. This Josephson microphone, it's called a C700. It's kind of a complex design. There are two capsules. I don't know if you can see that through there, but there are two capsules in the microphone. There's an omnidirectional capsule, and then there's a figure-8 capsule underneath it. And the output of the microphone is split into two signals, into the two capsules, and then you use the desk to combine those two capsules to shape the polar pattern and the proximity response of the microphone. So if you use more of the figure-8 microphone, it's more directional and you have more proximity effect, and it gets bassier when you choke up on the mic, and it gets slightly brighter as you get farther away. If you use more of the Omni microphone, then it's less sensitive to physical movement in front of the microphone. These mics, these Octava mics, these are a couple $100 at a guitar shop, and for a few $100 you get a comprehensive array of capsules and accessories for decent sounding condenser microphones. As it turns out, this has become one of my favorite snare drum microphones. I use these Octava microphones with this additional pad between the capsule and the body. I use these on snare drum, I would say 50% of the time these days. I think it's a terrific sounding microphone. We have a U48, which is another expensive microphone. Classic vocal microphone, used on a million famous recordings, super collectible microphone. I don't know what it's worth, like 20 grand, 15 grand? I have no idea. It's worth whatever some blues lawyer wants to pay for it, I was fairly ruthless when I was acquiring equipment. If something wasn't getting used, I would get it out of my sight. unless it had some very specific characteristic that would make it useful once in a blue moon but unique, then we would just shift it and get it, and move on to something else. Our scheduling is so tight. We operate on a razor-thin margin, so we have to have things booked nose to tail all the time. So we cannot afford to have a session-stopping catastrophe. We can't afford to have something happen that means we are the fault that caused the session to break down. So that's an obligation that we've adapted to by simplifying things like, okay, this microphone is very useful in this application, let's have 4 of them. So that way no engineer would have to say, oh, I'm sorry you can't use that because it's in use in the other studio. We have multiples of basically every piece of useful equipment that is in regular use. This is center field. This is one of the main performance spaces in Studio A. Typically we'll have amplifiers in here and the drum set in the Kentucky room, although sometimes it goes the other way around where you have the drum kit out here and then either amplifiers or acoustic instruments isolated from the drum kit that way. We have a couple of pianos here. It's a converted Steinway player piano, which is, I think it's an H series piano from the 20s. And this is a contemporary Baldwin piano, sort of run-of-the-mill generic Baldwin piano. They sound good. We have a Hammond B3, chopped down Hammond B3 that used to be a touring Hammond. There's a tack piano over here that we bought from Goodwill. There's a little spinet that we bought from the Goodwill for $100, I think. And then the hammers have tacks, metal carpet tacks inserted in them to make the sound a little clankier. It's a technique that was originally used to make pianos louder in the Old West, which is why they're sometimes called honky-tonk pianos when they're a spinet piano like that with metal hammers, a tack piano. In 1990, I want to say, the band I was in at the time did some shows in the UK with Sonic Youth, and when we got back as a thank you to them, I had the excellent guitar maker and repair guy Jeff Benge make an experimental guitar which had 16 strings on it. This is a duplicate of that guitar. And I sent that guitar to Sonic Youth as a thank you for having my band play shows with them.
This was made for us by Steve Albini in Chicago, given to us, I think, probably in the late 80s when he was, I think, still doing Big Black. It's 16 strings, 16 high E strings. It's got an inlaid penis in the headstock, and it says Sonic 16 up there. Maybe that's its most notable feature besides the 16 high E strings.
And but before I sent it off, I got to play it, and I really thought it was fun to play, so I had to make another one. It has 16 strings. Typically, it's used as a drone instrument, and all the strings are tuned the same. There you can tell that some of them are out of tune, which is kind of inevitable when there are 16 of them. Mind your head going down here, it gets low. So this is the drum storage area for all the studios. It's a common drum storage area. We have a bunch of drum kits. There's a Vistalite drum kit, Vistalite Ludwigs. These were actually the first drum kit of Todd Trainer, the drummer in the band Shellac, with whom I have played for more than 25 years. This is a Ludwig Mod Orange drum kit. These were a gift from Robin Goodridge, the drummer from the band Bush. I did an album with the band Bush, and it was successful beyond my wildest expectations. And as a thank you on the anniversary of its release, which is probably when the royalty statement came in, Robin gave me that drum kit. What a nice guy. This is a Gretsch drum kit with Yamaha hardware on it that was put together by Joey Haggerty, one of the Haggerty brothers. That's probably the most Chicago name you can imagine. Joey Haggerty. Joey Haggerty, turns out he's a plumber too. His dad was the head of the plumbers union. That's also the most Chicago thing you can imagine. This big coffin over here is the punch block interconnection of all of the audio lines in the studio. You can see it's a real fucking Medusa's nest. Or is that a term? Medusa's head? Of audio cables. And there's over 1 million connections in this studio. Like if you think of the number of wires that go between one place and another, and then at each end of each wire it has to be terminated for the 3 legs, the ground or the drain, and then the hot leg and the cold leg all need to be terminated. There's well over 1 million connections that needed to be made individually just to get the studio off the ground. One of the design principles of this studio is that the adobe walls form a kind of a structure in the same vein as the external envelope of a building. So these walls have their own foundations and their own footings, and adjoining rooms don't share foundation walls or foundations or footings. So each room is mechanically isolated from its neighboring rooms. So there is very little interaction between the rooms acoustically. There's very little coupling between the rooms. This room is the Kentucky room. I don't know if you can tell from the sound of my voice, but it's considerably brighter and more reflective and more energetic. This is the easiest place to see one of the design features of the studio, which is that there's a separation between the floor and the wall here. And what that does is it allows low frequency energy to go into the basement and use the air volume in the basement beneath this room as a coupled air volume that extends the low frequency response of this room. This is Alcatraz, which is the isolation room for Studio A. Behind these panels are hanging membrane absorbers that go all the way around the room. There's a cross-section of that on our website as well if you take an interest in it. But the hanging membrane absorbers absorb high, mid, and low frequencies, and then there's an additional low frequency absorption from the flexing of the membrane. We wanted to make rooms where this was a no bullshit dead isolation room, absolute like fucking sound purgatory, you know? Like this is where all waveforms go to die. Right now we are in Studio B. This is the live room of Studio B. The live room of Studio B doesn't have a clever name like Alcatraz or the Kentucky room. It's just called the live room. And that's because Studio B only has 2 performing areas. It has the live room and it has the dead room. This is the loading door that goes out to the alley, but it also serves the function of being an isolation booth. So you can, if you want to, the least likely place for somebody to be in a session is behind that door. Up there is the control room for Studio B, and that the idea there is that if you're in the control room, you can look down into the performing space, but people can also have a degree of privacy when they're down here so that they don't feel like they're quite in the fishbowl the way they are in a lot of studios. This whole control room, basically as is, that is these equipment racks, this console, those tape machines, all of this was moved sort of whole from the bungalow that I used to live in about a mile from here. This control room was up in the attic of that bungalow, and the performing areas were in the basement of that house. So the band would finish a take down in the basement and they'd have to go up 2 flights of stairs to the control room. And I used to sort of fantasize about when I'd have my own, I'd be able to own a building someplace and I could build a nice studio, and then that wouldn't be the case. And then we built Studio B, and now when the band finishes a take, they got to come up 2 flights of stairs to come listen to it, you know. I think it's partly due to my sympathies being formed with my participation in the music scene, where it was difficult for a band to get a recording made, and then when a band would go into the studio, it was difficult to find an engineer or a studio environment that was sympathetic to their aesthetic. Like when the punk scene was in full flight, a lot of the bands wanted to be rather brutal. Like they wanted their music to be ugly and confrontational and in more than one way unflattering, right? But the studio experience of that era, the late 70s, early 80s, the studio experience was very sanitized. So when a band would take their rough, ugly, crude music into the studio engineer, with the best intentions, would try to smooth things out, would try to make things sound more coherent, more conventional, more palatable to him, right? And in the process, those people did a lot of damage to some of my favorite bands. And I took that as an object lesson on myself as an engineer, that if music comes into the studio and I'm in charge of the session and I don't get it, like if they're doing something that I don't get and that I think is a mistake and that I think is fucked up and wrong, my first impulse should not be to change things. My first impulse should be to make an accurate recording of what they are doing. And that kind of respect for what the band brings in through the front door is what I think has allowed our studio to be useful to so many different genres and idioms of music. The visual interaction and the real-time aspect of the performance, I think, are the most important aspects. The fact that when the drummer indicates that he's going to go to the chorus, everyone can see that he's about to go to the chorus, and so everybody goes to the chorus at the same time with the same intensity and the same accent. That makes a bigger difference to me than that someone might be metronomically accurate in timing. You know, the fact that everyone does things together naturally, and you know, that's what ensemble playing means. It means, you know, all together. That goes a much greater distance towards simulating or evoking the experience of a live performance than any kind of sort of technical accuracy would. I don't know when or why, but about a year ago, Rod Stewart made an appearance at the studio. And now whenever a vocalist is lacking inspiration, his bandmates typically will put Rod up in front of him. And then I guess that's supposed to help. I don't know. All right, I have some of the worst pedals here. You're gonna love these. These are the worst. The acoustic feedback eliminator. It's supposed to be a noise gate. It is not a noise gate. It shuts off the sound with a violent clack whenever you stop playing. And in order to start playing, you have to start playing and let it go for a while, and then it'll open up. There's an attack control, which is the speed at which it opens up. The speed is never less than about a half a second, right? The pink Walco fuzz tone generator, the worst fuzz tone ever. It makes your guitar a lot quieter. Like, why would you do that? I think the idea behind that is that you would wear it on the strap, and that way you could play with the knob and get it just right. This one plugged into your amplifier, and then you would have this control on your amplifier where you couldn't reach it when it wasn't working correctly. This is the bass treble expander, and all it is a tone control. It's like an active tone control, and you can either have more bass or more treble with that switch. That's it. That's all it is. But it does come with a clip. I don't know where it ended. We had a tremolo of theirs. The Walco tremolo was called the Sound Go Round. If you made a tremolo out of a relay that was just clacking on and off, that's what the Sound Go Round sounded like completely unusable. Okay, this is the Gaiatone Noise Defender. I bought that, I went to Japan in 1989 maybe, and I did a tour with Zenny Geba as an additional guitar player. And I wanted a noise gate, but I didn't want to carry too much stuff with me in my luggage. for weight reasons, so I just brought a guitar. I didn't bring my noise gate or my fuzz tone. And so I bought this noise gate, this noise defender at a music shop in Japan. This noise defender is meant to be a noise gate, but it actually makes it noisier when it shuts off. It hisses when it shuts off, and when it's open, it sounds like a guitar, but when it shuts off, it hisses. I don't think that's intentional. I think that's just a fault. But it was the cheapest noise gate in the shop, so that's why I bought it. They also had a fuzz tone that was the cheapest fuzz tone in the shop, and it was called the Jazz Fusion pedal. As a combination, I traveled the farthest and wasted the most in terms of percentage of value on those two pedals of any purchase I've ever made. It's now totally standard for every electrified member of an ensemble to have their own pedal board. Totally standard. It used to be that people would just plug into an amp, or maybe they'd have a fuzz tone or something. But now it's rare for somebody to show up and not have a pedal board. And their pedal boards are usually quite personalized. Like they'll have these individual things that they use for specific sounds. So if we have a comprehensive library of pedals, it just makes it easier on somebody who may not have been able to bring everything they wanted, or maybe doesn't own the ideal thing. All of these special effects, the rainbow machine and the dirty polyphonic harmonizer with overdrive, which is the pitch bay, all of those have proven very, very useful recently. Super comprehensive echo pedal, really useful. A lot of controls, but fairly intuitive, easy to get by. Had a really terrific, this was very useful on one session. The dirty polyphonic harmonizer with overdrive, that description of it enabled somebody to say, oh yeah, that's exactly what I need. And then he grabbed that. These little labels that John Sanpaulo, America's top liked guy, works here at Electrical Audio. And he put these little descriptions on, like a lot of the pedals are fairly intuitive, like something like this, where there's one knob and a switch and a light that tells you it's on. That's not going to be a problem. Like even if you don't know what that knob does, you know if it's more or less, and you know if it's on or not, and that's really all you need to know, right? More complex pedals like that, it really helps to have some kind of description, some sort of like practical description on them. So JSP took it on himself to try every one of these pedals and write up his own little brother label mate description on each of them. I recommend that as a practice for anyone that ends up with a bunch of Earthquaker Devices pedals. I feel a heavy responsibility to the bands that I record, that their music, this is their life's work. Might be their one shot. This might be their only chance ever to make an indelible impression, right? And my responsibility is to make sure that it survives. And I don't really have that much of a responsibility on the creative side. If your songs are great, that's on you. If you sing well, that's on you. If you make people cry with your guitar solo, that's you. That's not me. The only thing that I can fuck up is I can make it so that eventually disappears and people can't hear it. And that's the thing that weighs on me. That's the tragedy that I cannot allow.